Today's video is sponsored by War Thunder. In the depths of the Pacific, Imperial Japan's submarines once prowled as silent predators. Yet by the end of World War II, nearly 3 out of every 4 of those boats had been wiped out. How did a fleet, boasting some of the largest, farthest-ranging submarines on the planet, end up decimated in just a few years of war? From bold doctrines and advanced torpedoes, to desperate one-way missions and relentless Allied countermeasures, every chapter of their story led to the same grim fate. This is the story of why so many Japanese submarines didn't survive the Second World War. Japan entered World War II with a formidable submarine arm on paper. The Imperial Japanese Navy had 63 ocean-going submarines at the outbreak of war and would complete 111 more during the conflict, for a total of 174. Many of Japan's boats were enormous, built for extreme range and endurance. They produced some of the largest submarines in the world at the time, giants over 400 feet long and more than 5,000 tons submerged. Some could cruise 20,000 to 37,500 miles without refueling and remain at sea for months. These fleet submarines were meant to scout far ahead of Japanese task forces or even reach enemy shores. One special class, the I-400, was so massive it carried 3 folding-wing seaplanes in a hangar on deck. By war's end, Japan had built 41 submarines capable of launching aircraft, something no other navy managed in the war. Japan's boats also carried formidable weapons. Their Type 95 torpedoes ran on oxygen and kerosene, giving them far greater range than most Allied submarine torpedoes and a much heavier punch. They carried large warheads, left almost no wake, and unlike many early American torpedoes, usually detonated when they hit. On paper, the IJN's undersea force was among the most advanced in the world, long-ranged, heavily armed, and technically ambitious. But numbers and technical innovation alone were not enough to ensure success in the Pacific. Japanese naval doctrine set its submarines on a dangerous course from the beginning. The IJN had long been shaped by the idea of a decisive fleet battle, influenced by its victory over Russia at Tsushima in 1905. In that vision, submarines were not primarily commerce raiders. They were scouts and fleet weapons. They were supposed to observe, shadow enemy warships, report movements, and strike major combat vessels before a climactic surface engagement. That decision shaped the whole war. Instead of concentrating on merchant shipping, the way German U-boats did in the Atlantic, Japanese submarines were usually directed toward warships, fleet movements, and distant reconnaissance. That gave them difficult targets. A merchant ship could be sunk and replaced only with time and industrial effort. A convoy route could be attacked again and again. But a fast-moving fleet screened by destroyers and aircraft was much harder to find, and even harder to strike. Japanese submarines were being sent after the most heavily protected targets in the Pacific. Early in the war, this seemed to pay off. In 1942, Japanese submarines scored several impressive successes against Allied warships. In September 1942, I-19 fired a spread of torpedoes that not only sank Wasp, but also damaged the battleship North Carolina and a destroyer. Earlier, at Midway, I-168 slipped in to finish off the crippled Yorktown. Such attacks validated the doctrine in Japanese eyes. But these victories proved impossible to sustain. Warships were elusive, heavily guarded targets. After 1942, as Allied defenses and tactics improved, Japanese submarines never again achieved comparable success against combat vessels. Japanese submarines did sink merchant ships, but nowhere near on a scale that could affect the wider war. As 1943 and 1944 wore on, Japan's insistence on using its submarines primarily against warships, and later for special attack missions, yielded diminishing returns and mounting losses. Before we continue, today's video is sponsored by War Thunder. War Thunder is one of the most comprehensive military vehicle combat games ever made, and you can play it for free on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, and mobile devices. The game features over 2,500 vehicles from 10 major nations, including tanks, aircraft, helicopters, and naval vessels, spanning everything from the biplanes of the 1920s to modern fighter jets and main battle tanks. War Thunder places you directly into intense combat with highly detailed vehicles, realistic visuals, and authentic sound design. What really sets the game apart is its detailed damage system. Instead of simple hit points, vehicles are modelled down to individual components, and the X-ray damage view shows exactly how a vehicle was destroyed. That level of detail is why over 95 million players worldwide play War Thunder. Play War Thunder for free on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, and mobile devices using my links in the pinned comment or video description. New players and returning players on PC and consoles who haven't played in 6 months will receive a massive bonus pack, including premium vehicles, the exclusive Eagle of Valor decorator, 100,000 Silver Lions, and 7 days of premium account time, available for a limited time. If Japanese submarines were advanced in some respects, they also had critical vulnerabilities that grew more apparent as the war progressed. Their emphasis on large, long-range boats came at a price. Many of the fleet submarines were big and relatively easy to spot. A giant submarine riding high on the surface was easier for lookouts and radar to detect than the smaller profile of a German U-boat. These large submarines were also slower to dive. In an ocean filled with Allied aircraft and warships, a few extra seconds on the surface could mean the difference between escape and destruction. Underwater, they were less maneuverable and easier to track on sonar. Japanese submarines also could not dive as deep or withstand as much punishment as German U-boats. Their hulls were less robust, limiting safe depth and making them more fragile under depth charge attack. Throughout most of the war, Japanese submarines also lacked radar for search and warning. The IJN did not begin installing radar on submarines until mid-1944, and even then, only a few boats received sets, usually inferior to Allied equipment. That meant many Japanese submarines sailed almost blind to approaching danger. At night, or in poor weather, Allied ships and aircraft with radar could detect and close in before the submarine crew had any hint they were in danger. Compounding this was the rapid improvement in Allied anti-submarine warfare. By 1943 and 1944, Allied destroyers, frigates, and aircraft carried advanced sonar, direction-finding equipment, to spot surfaced boats at night. New weapons, like the Hedgehog mortar, made attacks far deadlier than traditional depth charges. Japan's undersea hunters increasingly became the hunted, and their boats were not as well suited to survival under this pressure. By mid-war, Allied forces were not just defending against submarines, they were actively hunting them. Intelligence and code breaking played a major role in turning the tables. Allied radio intercept units regularly broke Japanese naval codes and decrypted messages detailing submarine routes and missions. Armed with that knowledge, the Allies set traps. In May 1944, US codebreakers decoded a message about a planned Japanese submarine picket line north of the Admiralties. The Japanese were moving several boats into position to ambush an expected American carrier force. Instead, the hunters became the hunted. The US Navy dispatched a hunter-killer group of destroyer escorts led by USS England. Over just 13 days in May 1944, England and her consorts methodically sank 6 Japanese submarines. One by one were detected and destroyed, a feat unmatched in anti-submarine warfare. In these encounters, Allied superiority was clear. England's group had surface search radar that picked up Japanese submarines at night from miles away. Once the targets dived, new sonar tactics came into play. On May 24, 1944, England relentlessly pursued Row 116 in darkness. The Japanese crew tried evasive maneuvers and even attempted to jam the sonar. It failed. England fired a salvo of Hedgehog projectiles. Several detonated directly on the hull, and Row 116 disappeared in a violent underwater explosion. This pattern repeated across the Pacific. Radar-equipped aircraft patrolled wide areas, ready to pounce on submarines recharging on the surface at night. In June 1944, the Japanese submarine I-52 attempted a secret voyage to Europe. Alerted by code breaking, the US Navy stalked it with a carrier group. Radar-equipped Avengers from USS Bogue located the boat at night and sank it with an acoustic homing torpedo dropped from the air. By late 1944, even Japanese submarines fitted with radar became liabilities. In February 1945, USS Batfish sank 3 Japanese submarines in 4 days off Japan by homing in on their radar emissions. There was virtually no safe haven left. As the tide of war turned, Japan grew increasingly desperate in how it used its submarines. By 1943 and 1944, many boats were assigned to resupply and reinforcement missions for isolated island garrisons. Cut off by Allied blockades, outposts in the Solomons, New Guinea, and elsewhere were starving for food, ammunition, and medicine. Submarines were among the few means of slipping through Allied lines. This was a strategic dead end. A submarine's cargo capacity was tiny compared to a freighter, and using high-value boats this way meant they were not attacking enemy ships. Worse, supply missions often required approaching predictable destinations, making the boats easier for Allied patrol craft and aircraft to find and destroy. Many submarines were lost while trying to deliver rice, fuel, or ammunition under the cover of darkness. Japan also turned to suicidal weapons. In late 1944, the Navy deployed the Kaiten program, manned suicide torpedoes launched from modified submarines. The idea was born of desperation. If conventional attacks were failing, perhaps a guided suicide weapon could still sink an American warship. In practice, Kaitens achieved little. One notable success came when I-47 sank the fleet oiler USS Mississinawa at Ulithi in November 1944, but such successes were rare. More often, the parent submarines were themselves lost. Each Kaiten mission became a double suicide operation, one man in the torpedo and often an entire submarine crew on the motherboat. By 1945, Japan was preparing even more extreme missions. The huge I-400 class submarines, originally intended to bomb the Panama Canal, were reassigned to a last-ditch plan to strike the US fleet anchorage at Ulithi with their onboard aircraft. The mission was never carried out, but its existence showed how far the force had been driven from conventional submarine warfare. The cumulative effect was a catastrophic loss rate. Early in the war, sinkings were relatively infrequent, but once Allied forces focused on the Imperial Japanese Navy's undersea fleet, the toll accelerated. Japanese submarines began to perish in ones and twos, then by the handful. By mid-1943, the cracks were showing. In 1944, losses exploded. During the Marianas Campaign and the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, several Japanese submarines were caught by overwhelming American air and sea power. One example was I-184, a Type KD-7 boat commissioned only the year before. On June 19, 1944, as the battle raged overhead, I-184 was found lurking in the area. A US Navy Avenger from the escort carrier USS Suwannee delivered a precise depth charge attack. The blasts sent I-184 to the bottom with all hands. Incidents like this became common. Japanese submarines operating near major fleet actions found themselves overwhelmed by Allied air-sea supremacy. After American forces retook the Philippines and pushed closer to Japan in late 1944 and 1945, the surviving submarines faced even worse odds. American destroyers and patrol craft dominated the sea lanes, while constant aerial patrols made it perilous for any boat to surface even briefly. Many of the newly built submarines were crewed by hastily trained sailors, replacing seasoned veterans lost earlier. These men had little chance against experienced Allied ASW teams. By the final year, sinkings came almost as fast as Japan could commission new submarines. Out of 174 submarines built and deployed during the war, 128 were lost. That was roughly 74% of the entire force. Most of the few survivors never saw combat or were training boats that remained in home waters. Why did 3 out of 4 Japanese submarines never make it home? In the end, it was a lethal combination of flawed strategy, enemy supremacy, and inadequate adaptation. Japanese doctrine put submarines in harm's way from the beginning. Sending them after warships meant operating against alert, fast, well-defended targets, often near enemy bases and patrol zones. The decision not to focus on commerce raiding allowed Allied supply lines to grow stronger, while leaving Japan's submarines increasingly isolated. When those boats were later diverted into supply runs and suicide missions, they were pulled even farther from any role that might significantly affect the war. On the technical side, Japan's submarines, despite their innovations, lagged in crucial areas of survivability. Their size, slow dive times, and limited diving depth made them easier prey for Allied sensors and weapons. Their lack of effective radar and warning gear until very late meant they were often surprised and destroyed before they could react. By the time Japan belatedly installed a few radar sets, the Allies had already learned how to exploit them. Meanwhile, Allied anti-submarine warfare reached a level Japan could not counter. Radar, sonar, depth-charge mortars, escort carriers, long-range patrol aircraft, code-breaking, and careful coordination all combined into a system the Japanese submarines could not escape. By 1944, Allied forces understood Japanese submarine capabilities and habits well enough to exploit nearly every weakness. Some Japanese commanders still stalked targets skillfully, but more and more often they found nothing to shoot at and little chance of returning safely. In short, Japan's submarines were outmatched and outmaneuvered on every front: strategic, technological, and tactical. The 74% loss rate was the final measure of that mismatch. When World War II ended in August 1945, only a few dozen Japanese submarines remained afloat, and most of those were newly built units that had barely left port or older boats relegated to training roles. Under the terms of surrender, these surviving boats were handed over to the Allies. None remained in Japanese service. Some of the most advanced were examined by the US Navy. As the Cold War emerged, most of the captured submarines were deliberately scuttled rather than risk falling into Soviet hands. For the Japanese submariners, the war's end was somber. The few surviving crews surrendered their boats, while most of their comrades had already perished. The Imperial Japanese Navy's submarine force had effectively ceased to exist, having sacrificed itself for very little gain. The legacy of Japan's World War II submarines is one of ambition, technical creativity, and misused potential. They were long-ranged, heavily armed, and in some cases remarkably advanced. But they never crippled Allied supply lines or altered the course of the Pacific War. Instead, they were gradually consumed by Allied counterattack. By VJ Day, the once feared shadow fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy was mostly silent wreckage on the ocean floor. It is a testament to the unforgiving nature of undersea warfare, and to the overwhelming power the Allies marshaled against Japan, that so few of Japan's submarines survived the conflict. The ocean depths around the Pacific are dotted with their hulks, now eternal steel tombs, bearing witness to a Navy's vanished ambitions and a wartime undersea campaign that proved fatally one-sided. And, before we wrap up, thanks again to War Thunder for sponsoring today's video. You can play War Thunder for free on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, and mobile devices. Make sure to sign up using my links in the pinned comment or video description. New players and returning players on PC and consoles who haven't played in at least 6 months will receive a massive bonus pack when registering through my link. That includes multiple premium vehicles to help you get started. The bonus pack is available for a limited time, so make sure to claim it through the link.